Hi, Toby. I'm Sarah from The Upcoming. A real pleasure to speak to you today. Thanks a lot for taking the time. Obviously, main conversations leading up to the release of Blur live at Wembley, but it's hard to talk about one without the other in terms of the documentary that's already come out earlier this year, Blur to the End. So I don't know, maybe you can just give us a bit of a brief intro to the overall project and how, one film kind of fits with the other.
Because it was such a big deal that Blair were playing Wembley Stadium for the first time in their career. It felt that there was sort of two sides to it. One, there's obviously the story of how that happened and came to be, as well as numerous other elements that were sort of going on in the band, sort of like kind of timeline at that point. So that was something to focus on. It's such a monumental venue, and this in terms of the way it was captured from a performance perspective. So they're kind of two films. It's like it's kind of cool that like the concert film's coming out now. It's almost the sort of I guess the sort of sequel, if you will, to the documentary. And the documentary really I kind of wanted to make that a story about sort of friendship and people sort of kind of going through different things in their lives and the sort of ups and downs that come with that. And certainly in the band story, not everything is always kind of beautiful and serene and plain sailing. So we wanted to sort of kind of uncover a bit of that in a respectful way, and then put that in the context of the band coming up to their biggest ever gigs at Wembley. And then the concert film, which is obviously about to come out, like that was really about trying to make a stadium show feel epic, but equally also trying to shrink it visually. So it still feels as intimate and hopefully as exciting as seeing Blur in a small club. So that's what I tried to do in the direction, was to try and make Wembley feel as kinetic and as punk and as raucous as a stadium show could feel.
And in terms of how you came on board with the project, I mean, I was sort of flabbergasted reading your whole bio. You've been in the music industry such a long time. You've worked with so many artists in different aspects, with your different kind of companies, but also on other music films and other documentaries. But how might have this one been a bit different? And at what point did they kind of bring you on? Because obviously they were maybe thinking about, coming back together to make that album, The Ballad of Darren, for some time. But, at what point did they approach you and say, look, we want to make this our whole project, and then eventually obviously have the concert film too?
So the conversation about capturing Wembley as a concert film, it started just before they started making The Ballad of Darren. And I was sort of at Damon's studio regarding, as you mentioned, because I do a few different things in music. I also like run a label and do a few other things with my friends called Transgressive. But I was at Damon's studio to talk about a completely different project. And out of the blue, just when I thought maybe the day was ending, he was like, "So, do you want to hear the new Blur demos?" And I was like, "What?" And like, I think even other people around him at that point were like, "Blur demos?" And we went into the studio and he just played like a bunch of, very lo-fi but extremely charming, massively melodic songs that were the basis of the Ballad of Darren, in terms of the initial writing. And Wembley was about to be announced to the fans, so I knew it was in the diary. I've been tipped off about it, and my production company made like a little teaser to announce that show was coming. But then I didn't hear for months really that I or we were going to get the gig to make the documentary and the film. So they started making the album. And I was conscious, gosh, if there is going to be a film, I really want to get them in the studio as they make this amazing, new music. Thankfully, we got the sort of nod that we were going to be able to make it just in time. So we were able to shoot them whilst they were making the album. And there's certainly the last stages of it. And then ultimately cover them all the way through rehearsals, through to all the warm-up shows, through to obviously some of their big European shows, going to their homes, going to their studios, really getting involved, and then also obviously all the way up to Wembley. So that was kind of like the arc of it. And yeah, I had to pitch quite aggressively, even though I knew a couple of the members. Like I had to sort of prove that I was the person for the job to direct it. And there was a meeting with all four members, and thankfully I passed the test. There were some, tough questions in that conversation about, the merits of making a film right now. But thankfully the band went on that journey with me. And then in regards to the concert film, I think that was an easier sell than a documentary. The sell for that was like, this is you performing your biggest ever gig. It would be lunacy to not capture this, in a majestic, beautiful way. And my again, as I said earlier, my pitch for that was I wanted to ensure there was the expanse. So we had 20 Alexas. So visually it was going to be very well covered. But beyond coverage, I wanted it to feel genuinely built for the big screen, making sure that the movement of the cameras that we have from a tech perspective and the grip that we got, like some amazing things like tower cams in the middle of the pitch that aren't usually permitted at Wembley, as well as at the back of the stage. And we also managed where the golden circle barriers were to get some like tracking shots, which is quite hard to get agreed and approved. Obviously, there's beautiful drone footage to get overheads and aerial shots. So we really went to town on trying to make it feel as epic and as Wembley could feel. But then equally, I made sure there were loads of handheld cameras around the band because they're quite a punk live band. So I wanted to make sure that the energy of them on stage was really followed by people that were moving with the music. So it wasn't too posh at all times and it wasn't too controlled, because sometimes you watch live concerts on TV or in the cinema, and I don't know about you, but I think a lot of the time they don't capture the emotion or the energy of the show. So for me, we went to town on just trying to pull out every trick possible to make sure that if you weren't there, hopefully this is the next best thing, or who knows, maybe as good. That was what the aspiration was.
And thinking of the documentary, I guess, first and foremost, in terms of the form of that, I mean, not your first rodeo in terms of making these documentaries, but there are different approaches, sort of more the talking heads and, running commentary. Was this very much the fly on the wall? So, what kind of dictated that for you? And then I guess it's sometimes just leaving that camera running, and you do capture these immense moments of vulnerability, when Damon Albarn breaks down listening to the studio playback, or these amazing nuggets, talking about sort of the abandonment of the ego, when you truly want to be in a band. So what was your approach in that sense? And was that something you set out to do from the beginning?
Absolutely. Like, I mean, personally speaking, I really struggle with documentaries when I feel that I'm being spoon-fed as an audience member. I think there's just a lot of reality TV pretending to be documentary, and by the way, when I say reality TV, I mean that with the sort of cynicism that comes with reality TV, it's all manipulated, and I really struggle with that. And when I sat down with the band for that meeting to talk about how we would make the film, I don't think that they would have approved any other approach. They said they're sick of documentaries being set up and artificial feeling as well. And so fly on the wall for me, just, I don't know. I mean, I don't know about you. I mean, for some people in 2024, maybe they feel they've seen that before, but for me, that's the truest essence of a scene. If you can blend into the background and allow life to happen and the camera happens to be there, that to me is far more impactful and meaningful than sit center of the screen, put that light there, ask questions, add that bit of soundtrack sync to show some drama, punch in on the facial reaction. I mean, fuck all that. I mean, it's just trash, isn't it?
Did you have a favorite moment, either when you were shooting it or I guess maybe in the edit, just sort of like there are some absolute gems, aren't they? It's sort of like, even preparing the Wembley shows, it's like, okay, this needs to be good enough. Otherwise, we're just going to be like old timers, just trying to relive our youth, or, when it's even them being quite candid about aging, or Damon riling the others up, being a bit too perfectionist. Like, did you have a favorite moment? Or also maybe you're a bit like, oh God, is this too much?
I've got so many favorite moments. I mean, I love the scene where we took Damon and Graham back to school, where they hadn't been back to school like most of us. Like, you leave school when you're, I don't know, anywhere between 16 to 18, and you kind of never look back in a way. Even if you've had a good experience, you're just so keen to move on to the next phase of your life. So to take people back, particularly them, to their school for the first time since they left, it was just an amazing experience. And what I loved watching is you kind of almost see these sort of great artists and great, sort of men of a certain age just suddenly regress into being teenagers again. They become a bit rebellious, a bit cheeky, a bit spiky, and also a bit vulnerable as well. So I loved that scene. When we were making it, I found it hilarious, and then when we edited it, it remained hilarious. So I just feel very fond of all four of them, and the honesty that they convey in the film. I don't think there are many artists that are of stadium stature that are probably as willing to be as open and vulnerable as they are in this film. And so I'm eternally grateful for them being so frank and upfront. And I think it's to their credit. Hopefully the viewer agrees that they were that way.
Yeah, because I think as a viewer, as a fan, feeling that you can relate to somebody who, maybe in your mind is someone who's quite kind of unreachable. And actually, even though you are focusing, one of the biggest British bands of all time, they've got the same preoccupations everyone else does about getting older and facing their mortality. And, do I still have it? And you almost, being a band, being a bit like a family where you have this indelible kind of connection, but you also piss each other off all the time. So do you think that's also, the essence of a film like that, is feeling like you can relate to them?
Yeah, massively, and that was important to me with it. If you think about it, when you're doing a documentary and the film's going to end with them headlining Wembley, and the odds are, because Blur have always been a great live band with obviously amazing songs, the odds are the gigs are going to be amazing, right? So you have to go into the film going, how am I going to actually make this not just a puff piece? How am I going to make sure that it's not just, and then everything was great because Blur headlined Wembley and ta-da, it's like, no one really needs that. People need to understand the work that goes into it, like both the craft of performance as well as making a record, as well as just being, as you say, a family that has ups and downs, the compromises that need to be made and felt in order to do your best work. And so that was, important to show the relatability and the fact that not everything is rosy when you're in a band or have been in a band for decades. There are highs and lows, and that is life. Like life is not one linear, everything gets better, unfortunately, as much as we would love it to be. There are bumps in the road. There are many unexpected things that both improve as well as, kind of like, totally uproot your existence. And so in a documentary, as much as you can in an hour and 3/4, we just try and showcase the broad spectrum of emotions and events that showcase what it's like to be in a band.
When it came to the sort of, the way that we were even talking about, the run up to these big gigs, it made me realize, well, have they never actually played Wembley before? I think in people's minds, they sort of remember it differently, that they were playing, venues of that scale. And I guess they never did, in contrast to Oasis at Nebworth, etc. And the fact that even though they're these veteran performers, that they could be intimidated by that prospect. So was that also kind of like an interesting angle for maybe people to realize?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when Blur reunited, like initially in 2009, like, they did two Hyde Parks, which is, not miles off the scale of Wembley. But in the 90s, there were two things, and I was just talking to someone else about this, but like, as much as the band are now bigger through their legacy now and the advent of streaming, as well as the power of like songs growing over time, the reality is in 1994 and 1995, like the band sold probably the equivalent of a Wembley Stadium, in terms of tickets. They did in the same, I think, 18-month period, they did Alexandra Palace and Mile End Stadium, which is seldom used, and multiple arenas in London, and they sold probably a similar amount of tickets. But in that era, it wasn't super cool for indie bands to play stadiums, like even if they were big enough. It was like in the 90s, it was like the Stones played Wembley Stadium. I think in a way Oasis and Blur, the reason they were so different is that Oasis always wanted to go, look where we've come, we're going to play two nights at Nebworth. I think even if Blur were like kind of like as big as they were, there was almost like a bit of an art school awkward taste thing about, we're not going to play a stadium. We'll just do, multiple nights at Wembley Arena or do Mile End Stadium, which is never used. And it's at the time, a part of London that was deemed to be pretty edgy, you know, and very, very different to other parts of town where bands played, you know. So I think Blur, like Radiohead, they're art school bands, you know, they're intellectual bands, and they came from an angle of, well, let's do the unobvious thing. However, you know, 30 years on, if there's something you've not done in an illustrious career, like played the National Stadium, things, you know, feel a bit different. You know, maybe you're like, well, why wouldn't we play it now? You know, the 90s are a very different time, you know, and we're a very different band now. So I think the allure of it kind of grew over time as just something that was, yeah, something different to do for them.
You know, in terms of that, you know, amazing moment of, you know, this, the stakes were so high and there was this massive build up, you know, maybe there's some kind of catharsis and then being able to watch this huge concert film. Do you feel like it is sort of a reunion and then they're going to go on? Or do you feel like this was kind of almost like a big farewell? I don't know. What was your feeling at the end of it all?
I feel like the documentary kind of keeps it open-ended. Like even though it's called To the End, I think there's intentional ambiguity at the end based on who you're listening to. Like some of the members of the band have different perspectives of what can happen next. You know, I think the door is ultimately left completely open, but equally, it's definitely the end of yet another chapter in the Blur, you know, saga, if you will. You know, and if it were to be the ultimate end, you know, like I don't think there could be a more beautiful ending, you know, but at the same time I think they're just creative spirits and they love working together creatively, and I would be shocked and I'd be also quite upset if they felt there was, it was done, you know, in terms of the artistic side of it. But they're never just going to be a nostalgia band, you know, as they acknowledge in the film. There's no way they were going to play Wembley Stadium without making a new record, a new body of work, you know. And there are some bands that are happy just to tour and it's great, and they just wheel out the hits that they've been playing for many, many years without any new tunes, and that's cool. Fair enough. That's entertainment, you know. Blur, as long as they exist in any form, they're always going to want to be progressive and vital. And whether that means they're doing that until their 80s or whether they're giving it a halt now, like either way it'll be what's right for the band, I would guess.
And I love that line where it's like, oh, the thing with Damon, if you don't sort of keep him focused, he'll just go off and write another opera or whatever it is. So,
Well, I mean, you know, I think it's been slightly publicized. I mean, he is actually working on another opera right now, so the comedy and the truth of that line is absolutely amazing. When we showed him the rough cut and he heard Alex make that gag, you know, like David was like, he was like, like kind of like a sort of that slightly annoying, but kind of entirely true.
what do you make of all the hysteria about Oasis getting back together? I mean, obviously we do just have such a nostalgia, don't we, for these bands, and they still just have such a prominent position in our kind of in our culture. But what have you made of all of that?
If we can ever be in a place in the UK where the thing dominating news feeds and headlines of newspapers is art or music or culture, then that's exactly the country I want to live in. I don't want to live in a country that is talking about corruption and the misspending of our public money, or you know, the deprivation and of so many, and also just the gap between rich and poor. I'm so sick and tired of that, and I really hope with all of my heart that, you know, our new government is able to sort of address that gross disparity that exists. But in the meantime, and alongside that, if music can bring people together and be the antidote to the pain that a lot of people are feeling right now, then so be it, you know. And for that reason, I'm delighted that the band are back. I think it's amazing that, you know, people like Oasis and Blur still command the power and hysteria that they do. And, you know, my other favorite band of that era, Pulp, you know, they've had their biggest comeback in the last 18 months as well. Like they sold out 45,000 tickets at Finsbury Park last summer. Apparently could have done a second one, and they were, again, they were never that big in the 90s. So I'm just delighted that if you think about it, the only way these bands can be playing bigger audience shows is because they're not playing just to the same people they play to. They're playing to new people. They're playing to younger people that weren't around then, that are hearing songs like Live Forever or Park Life or Common People, and they're seeing and hearing what we all heard first time round. So I think there's a lot of beauty and delight in that, because those bands and those songs were incredible, regardless of the awful labeling of Britpop. Like, the reality is that those artists were extremely gifted, and that's why their stories still resonate to this day, you know.
Absolutely. Very well put. Well, I'm out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for sharing all that with me. And for people who haven't seen Blur to the End, I hope they get to see that. And of course, the Stadium film that's coming out soon. Thanks a lot.